The Evil Dead came out 40 years ago today. 40 years ago, that is insane. And after 3 movies, a remake, a TV show, and tons of expanded universe stuff, there's bound to be some unanswered questions. So I figured what better way to celebrate 40 years of the ultimate experience in grueling horror than by answering those questions. But before we do, let's raise a toast. Nis Tutarin. Which means, Jerry?
Question number 1.
The first movie calls it Notorum Demonto, and the second calls it Necronomicon Ex Mortis. My patron Jared wants to know which is correct.
So the original Evil Dead gives the name of the book as the Notorum Demondo through a recording that Professor Noby leaves behind. But in the other 2 films, it's referred to as the Necronomicon Ex Mortis by everyone, including that opening narration. To complicate things, the remake also refers to it as the Demondo book, not Ex Mortis, and the second movie actually calls it both. Well, there's several options here that all make sense. For one, you have to realize that there's a question of continuity. Given that there's a soft reboot in the opening of the second film, with events playing out differently and with less characters, it's possible that it's 2 different universes. And of course, the remake being its own thing entirely, so 3 separate continuities. It's possible that the book's name is reflective of which continuity the films are set in, and in the universe of the first film and the remake, the name of the book is Notorum Demondo, and in the universe of the second and third, it's Necronomicon Ex Mortis. But although the direct translation of Notorum Demondo is on the nature of demons, while Necronomicon Ex Mortis is read as the Book of Death and Undeath, they are both the same book under different translations. You see, the Necronomicon didn't originate here. It was an invention of H.P. Lovecraft, and he wrote about it in a story entitled The History of the Necronomicon. In it, it's told that the book was written by the Mad Arab and originally titled Kitab al-Azif, which is Aramaic for the howling of demons, and Notorum Demondo being an Italian variation on that, with nature and howling being a close approximation. Necronomicon Ex Mortis is just an alternate translation for the same book, so either way that it's said is correct, actually. Question number 2.
Was playing the tape recorder even necessary?
Ash and Scotty find the old tape recorder in the basement of the cabin and play it, which seemingly unleashes the evil, setting it free to attack them and cause chaos, since their slumber has been disturbed. But considering that we see the thing in the woods in the very first scene of the movie, it's already up to no good. Like, making them almost crash. Isn't it already disturbed? I mean, when they pull up to the cabin, there's clearly forces at work, and Cheryl experiences a possession incident, so it's not like everything's normal. So here's the deal. For them to play the recording of the words being spoken, the words had to be spoken. Noby already said them and woke the demons up. When Ash and the crew enter the cabin, the writing is already on the wall, and evil forces are already on the loose in the woods. Playing the recorder just further agitates them and points them in the right direction to cause some trouble. Possibly gives them a little extra strength, I guess. I don't know why that would work. Reading the words twice would give them more waken up power, but whatever. It's also possible that Noby, with further looking into the book, was able to find another passage that was able to partially subdue the demons, taking away portions of their power, and the playing of the recorder once again restored them. Question number 3.
What was the point of the dagger?
The Kandarian dagger found in the cellar along with the book and tape recorder is an odd sort of curio. It's a pretty wicked blade with a distorted skull at the hilt. It's really cool looking, but what is its purpose? It was apparently discovered in the same ruins that they found the book in, and for the most part, it is just a knife. It's just a cool looking knife, but it does occasionally seem to be more. When stabbing Shelley, it appears to smoke, seemingly hurting the deadite more than just a regular puncture wound. Characters seem to place an unusual amount of importance on it. It wasn't until the TV show, when the dagger was brought into play, that it was there that it seems to reveal its overall relevance. It seems as if the blade is capable of actually wounding and killing the demons in their true forms, including the ultimate form of the Dark One.
They shoot it out of a tank. I mean, it's pretty freaking cool.
Question number 4.
Lee Cull wants to know, what are the rules for demon possession?
So it's Evil Dead. So of course a lot of people get possessed by demons, and it sure seems like the rules for it change from movie to movie. In the first film, possession occurs after one of the Deadites are able to inflict some sort of injury or damage to you, or by direct contact with the dark forces in the woods. Cheryl is attacked, if that's what you want to call it, by the branches, leaving her vulnerable to being taken over. Shelley comes face to face with the unseen entity, Linda is taken from a wound that spreads, and Scotty is assaulted to the point of the edge of death. Ash is not possessed because he doesn't have a face-to-face with the evil, and the others aren't able to inflict any damage that will weaken his body and leave it open for them. As Scotty is dying, Linda says that soon they'll come for him, and then they'll come for Ash, which seems to imply that they can't quite take him at that point, again, because he's not beaten down enough. In the second film, this kind of holds up, with Ed taken over after some damage from Henrietta, and Ash taken by the direct contact with the unseen force twice. As the series continues, it definitely makes less and less sense, with the possessions in Army of Darkness having less reasoning behind them, like the old witch and Sheila, and Big Time on the TV show, which seems like the Deadites can take over pretty much anyone at any time, and unless, of course, they can't. So ultimately, it seems that rule number 1 is that there are no rules, and possession is kind of random, and for the sole purpose of creating as much havoc as possible. One thing to clarify, though, is that Nobi says that the reading of the book gives the dark spirit license to possess the living. This kind of indicates that all of the Deadites that stem from this initial reading are all aspects of the same entity. All of the possessions are just the one Kandarian demon, splitting control into different aspects as a sort of hive mind kind of thing. Another thing that might come into play is the strength of will. It's often shown that people with a strong mind and sense of will are somewhat more resistant to the possessions than others, so that might play a factor. It's not 100% guaranteed, as nothing is in this world, but a definite possibility. Question number 5.
Your friendly neighborhood Uncle Pete asked me, what is the deal with the Freddy Krueger glove in the cellar?
While in the fruit cellar on the hunt for the pages, Ash sees a familiar prop on the wall. But what's it doing there? Well, there's a behind-the-scenes reason for it that actually goes back to the first Evil Dead movie. You see, Sam noticed that in Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, there was a torn Jaws poster up on the wall, as if the movie was saying, "This isn't scary, our movie is." Raimi decided to answer this in the first Evil Dead by putting up a Hills Have Eyes poster on their wall, having it torn in half as well. Wes responded by having Nancy watch The Evil Dead in the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, continuing the sort of mini feud. The glove in the cellar was the next round in this, so it's just a fun in-joke. But what about in-universe? Well, we know that there's a good possibility that the Evil Dead movies and the Freddy movies might take place in the same universe, since they were planning on a full-on Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash movie, so you'd have to assume that there was at least the intention of having their universe be shared. And even if not, there's a likelihood that there's a version of Freddy Krueger that exists in this continuity, even if he didn't go on to become a dream killer in this one. Here's the thing, the cabin is located in Morristown, Tennessee, which is only a couple of hours south of the Ohio border, where Springwood is located. We also know that the cabin is remote, and clearly a rental. So who's to say that Freddy, whatever universe version, didn't rent it out on occasion, using it as a little getaway? There's a chance that he even used it as a place to hide bodies, or at least work on his favorite murder weapon. If it is in the same universe, it'd have been down there for like a decade or so, since he'd have been dead for a while now. But if it's a separate universe and a separate continuity Krueger, possibly this version was never caught, never killed, and is still at work, and this cabin is still his occasional weekend stay. And hey, come to think of it, remember what I was talking about earlier, like a minute ago, that Nancy is watching The Evil Dead on TV, which actually means it is a separate continuity. And if there is a Freddy here, he's definitely a separate guy than the one from those movies. And, you know, he's still a large. Question number 6.
Who rented them the cabin anyway?
Here's an interesting question that actually changes from movie to movie. In terms of the first film, Scotty is the one that rented the cabin, although he hadn't seen it before. It's assumed that he rented from an agency or something. Just picture like a 1980 Airbnb, which is just some dude in an office that you'd have to actually go to, and he'd show you brochures. And I assumed he showed Scotty, this college kid, some pictures of a rundown old cabin and said, "You can afford this." And Scotty was like, "Perfect." Of course, the Nobies were there previously setting up the events that unfold. In the context of the first film, it's pretty simple. Professor Nobi rented the cabin to be a getaway to translate the book, was taken by the evil, and then the new renters arrived. However, the second film makes this confusing. Now we have the added burp of Scotty, not existing possibly in this one, but still Ash and Linda are there and rented it. But later in that film, it's revealed that the cabin is not just some simple rental that the professor is making use of. It's referred to as the old Nobi cabin, and Annie calls it her father's cabin. And this is the important part. She's on her way there because she's meeting him. But if the professor and his wife were supposed to be there relaxing and translating, how did Ash and Linda, or Scotty, rent it? Well, take a look at the cabin. Does it look like it gets rented very often? The Nobies probably have it listed with a rental agency, but it's clearly not a popular spot. It's probably been quite a while since anyone has taken some time there, so the family just didn't expect it to be rented. Perhaps the plan to go there to do the translation was a little spur of the moment in the aftermath of their big discovery, and they just neglected to check to see if the place happened to be rented by 5 college students on their way to an old abandoned cabin in the woods. There's also the theory that they never rented the cabin at all and they're just breaking in, but they've all never seen it, so that doesn't really make much sense. But there's also the possibility that they did rent a cabin, but maybe not this cabin. Maybe they got it mixed up, and maybe the evil in the woods did its thing to misdirect them, shifting the path to steer them in the way it wanted them to go. Perhaps they were never really meant to be at the Nobi cabin, and there was just some other vacation home nearby, sitting empty, waiting for some college kids. Question number 7.
Mike Bell, all the way from the UK, he wants to know, what does everyone see when that unseen force is chasing them?
There's an unseen force that plagues Ash, chasing him throughout the series, and is, in fact, the first thing that we see in the movies. It's a big part of the first 2 films, a smaller part of the third, and a big part of the TV show, including being the big bad in the very final episode. Although we mostly experience this creature through its own POV, we get a couple of tip-offs to what is actually there and what the characters are actually seeing. So at the ending of part 2, the demon bursts through the front door of the cabin, and it's this thing, affectionately known as Rotten Applehead. It's got big old teeth and faces of its victims on the side, and big nasty tree hands. But this form occurs after they've read the passages in the Necronomicon that made it flesh. So it's likely that it didn't actually appear like this when it was chasing people earlier, and that this is the first time that anyone is seeing this form, as evidenced by the fact that Ash is in shock when he sees it and his hair goes white, which I guess is temporary since it's gone at the start of the next movie. It's the first time that he's seen this thing, and he's probably the one who's looked at the demon the most. It shows up again in the very final episode of Ash vs. Evil Dead in Season 3, Episode 10, in this gigantic form that rampages across the entire town. However, this is after being manifested by the Dark Ones as the ultimate challenge for Ash, and again, is not the form that it usually takes, especially since something this big running around the woods will be something that I think would have been mentioned. But, as it turns out, the non-corporeal version has been seen, just not in the movies. The unseen force can be spotted in the TV show like in episode 4 of the first season, in which Ash looks in the rearview mirror and sees this, our first look at the Kandarian demon's form. It's a big cloud of yellowish fog, not too unlike the smoke monster from Lost, just not as disappointing, and there's no solid confirmation that this is the way that it normally appears while chasing them, but Ash seems to recognize it, and the filming method is the same. So I think that it can be assumed that this is what we're not seeing in most of those other shots. Question number 8.
Why does Ash's personality change so much between parts 2 and 3?
It's hard to imagine thinking of the character without his trademark personality.
Give me some sugar, baby.
That of a loudmouth braggart and perpetual idiot. But watching the first 2 films, he's not really portrayed that way. In the first, he's kind of a timid wallflower character, not very proactive, and only goes into action when there's no other choice. In the second, he's almost a superhero, becoming more and more adept at fighting as the movie goes on, becoming a literal hero from the sky. But in Army of Darkness, almost from the get-go, he's suddenly a buffoon, and his entire personality seems to have shifted. So what happened? Well, the whole second movie happened. Let's face it, over the course of that movie, the guy has a complete and total mental break. At one point in the movie, the dude is dancing with a desk lamp. Signs of his inner jerk start to creep through even here. After he breaks the possession and Annie tries to kill him, he almost completely snaps at her. By this point, he's hanging on by a thread. His friends are dead, he's lost his hand, and he's been possessed by a demon twice. And let's not discount that. The quirks in his personality could almost be a lingering influence of the Deadite control. They do seem a bit jerky and arrogant, so maybe a bit of that got left behind. Even without that influence, being catapulted back in time a few hundred years seems to have been the last straw of his psyche, and even though he's holding on to most of his mental faculties, a mark has clearly been made on his personality.
Don't touch that, please. Your primitive intellect wouldn't understand alloys and compositions and things with molecular structures in the...
Question number 9.
Robert Alexander wants to know, how exactly does Ash's fake hand work?
In Evil Dead 2, Ash famously cuts off his own hand with a chainsaw and then places that same saw in its place, and how that works is its own question. But we've got bigger fish to fry, because after going into the past, Ash decides that the saw isn't going to cut it.
Sorry.
And replaces it with the metal gauntlet from a suit of armor. It's rigged up by the blacksmith, but how does it work exactly? The hand is actually described online as made from heavy-duty springs, a ratchet, tension release trigger, and strong cable. In the Dark Horse comics, it's mentioned that Ash was using his engineering degree, I guess sort of explaining how he was capable of building it, and the script for Army described it as Ash's spring-driven iron hand.
Groovy.
So I think that the implication is that it's spring-loaded, but what activates those springs? I used to think that the answer was in these straps, and then it worked with extending his arm, like he'd move his arm forward and that would activate the spring, closing the hand. But as we see in the movie, it closes at random, with no real activation needed. Look at when he grabs this spatula thing. There doesn't seem to be any outside influence, and the hand just does it by itself, which is kind of impossible.
Unless there's magic.
Look, there's no way that this thing works with just straight engineering. Watch Ash throughout the film, and it just acts like a regular hand, and Ash controls it with his mind, as if through magic. And there is magic in this world. There's demons, time travel, geysers of blood that far exceed the amount in a human body. This universe is magical. Most of it is in the hands of the forces of darkness, but there is the wise man. He appears to have knowledge of the dark arts and handles the spell at the end of the movie, so it's clear that he knows his way around some magic. Even though we don't really see it, it's possible that the wise man was able to throw some minor enchantments around that thing to allow Ash to control it mentally. That would explain why Ash no longer has the gauntlet when we meet him again in the TV show. It's still working at the ending of Army, but he's ditched it and switched to a basic wooden hand for the show, so perhaps the spell faded over time, and without being able to control it, it was just heavy and unwieldy, so he ditched it in favor of a more lightweight wooden option. Question number 10.
Mr. Meathook wants to know if the remake is actually in continuity with the original series.
In 2013, of course, there was a remake, and although it shares some similarities to characters, most of them are new, and not just slight variations of Ash and Linda and the others. It's a mostly new story, just set in the same environment with some similar elements. The deltas here, the cabin, the book, etc., it's all the elements of the original, just kind of remixed. So is it in the same continuity? Well, according to the director, and Bruce Campbell, it definitely and definitively is. But, although there's hints to it being in the same cabin, it's clearly not. The book's different, it's Mia's family cabin, not the Nobies, and plus Ash's car wouldn't be there. It's either lost in the past somewhere, or he still has it like he does in the show, so that's not his Delta. But apparently, any similarities between this version and the old ones are caused by the book. The Necronomicon apparently misses Ash and warps reality to create echoes around it. In terms of the cabin not being the Nobies, again, I'm not convinced it's supposed to be the same cabin and it's just a similar one. Again, another echo that the book creates. If it is the same cabin, it could simply be that in the time frame between part 2 and the remake, it was purchased by Mia's family and they've been there since, and everyone involved has also stated that there was a plan to have Ash pick up Mia in a truck at the ending of the movie, confirming the connection, but was skipped in favor of a simple shot of Bruce saying groovy. Teaming the two characters up has been repeatedly discussed afterwards, although it looks like it'll never happen, although I guess we'll see what happens with Evil Dead Rise. But one thing's for sure, even if everything doesn't fit in exact measures, it's definitely intended to be in the same continuity. Question number 11.
Disco Doggy asks, if burying someone alive cures them, then shouldn't it have worked on Linda?
In the remake, we learned that there's several ways to save someone's soul after they're possessed, and they're all pretty fatal. One of them is bodily dismemberment, another is setting them on fire, and the third is burying them alive. In the final act, our hero, David, loses his sister to the sway of the Deadites. In an effort to save her, he attempts the burial, putting her under the ground. This actually works, since when he digs her up, she's human again, and he's able to jumpstart her breathing and restore her to life. Well, if this system works, and the remake is canon to the whole series, then could this have worked with Linda in the original films? Could she be fine? After all, in any versions of her fate, Ash ends up burying her. In the second film, her bodily actually comes up from under the dirt to continue her attack, until finally chopped up with a chainsaw. I mean, does that sound fine? Well, no, because there's one important word in the remake, and that's living burial, which I take to mean that the victim has to be alive before being placed in the ground for it to work. In the originals, before placing Linda 6 feet down, her head had been chopped off, so dead. Plus, Ash was unaware of the whole process, so he wouldn't know how it works anyway. He would have had to bury her before cutting off her head, and then making sure to wait a bit for her to die from a lack of oxygen, and then be able to dig her up and also resuscitate her. Looking back, it's interesting to note that if he did bury her before the old decap, but wasn't able to dig her up and restore her and whatever, that it still would have actually saved her soul, apparently. You know, come to think of it, I know that the whole process is supposed to save and restore their soul, but how did it restore her body? Shouldn't Mia's tongue still be split in half?
I'll have to cover that one in the future. Next time.
Question number 12.
How did Ash get the Necronomicon in the show?
So here's the thing. Is the Necronomicon in Evil Dead 2? Doesn't it go through the portal? Believe it or not, the answer to both of those questions is kinda no. Now, the book is there in the prologue of Part 2, which may or may not have happened ultimately. But if you go with the notion that the prologue isn't the real deal, and the movie really starts with Ash being thrown through the woods, picking up from the first film, Ash has just burned the book in the fire, destroying it. Now, if this movie stands alone, that incident may or may not have even happened, and the book wasn't burned. but it's never shown again after that. Every shot of the desk doesn't show it, and you'd figure that Annie would have been interested in it if she saw it there. Like, there's this priceless artifact that had been missing since 1300, and you just discovered it in the remains of some castle, and you see it all willy-nilly on a desk. I think that that'd be something you'd mention. Later on, all they talk about are the pages that were lost, and that they have in that glass case, and the book is nowhere around. In fact, in the second movie, the only time you see it is in the very beginning narration, and that time with Ash at the desk. So it's presumed that it did get put in that fire, like we saw, possibly even in this version of events, or at the very least, Ash got rid of it. But I prefer to think of all the movies as one story, so to me, Ash burned that book. When he goes back in time, the book is not sucked back with him. His encounter with the book there is the one that's native to that time period. There's some theories out there that the book is in a time loop and it's always the same book, but the book exists before Ash lands. Arthur's men know about it, and they had seen and read the prophecy about Ash that was in it. So that book had been there a while. It didn't just drop in via portal. So theoretically, after the events of Army, the book is locked up in the castle, hidden until the early 1980s, and then taken to that cabin where Ash encounters it again and throws it in a fire. Hey, side question that I guess I'll come back to in another video. Did the book recognize him?
Later.
But then, in the first episode of the show, Ash once again has the book in his possession. Now, this question tweaks a bit if you're placing the remake into continuity, which apparently definitely is, so the book that appears there is the same book, but how can it be after it was burned up? Well, the 2013 version actually sort of covers that, in that there's a scene in which they try to burn the book, but it won't catch fire. And if it's the same book, then one would have to assume that Ash's attempt in the first movie was actually equally unsuccessful. And in the second movie, the book is still there, sitting in the fireplace, perhaps covered in enough debris that it goes unnoticed. That just leaves explaining how the book went from just laying there to being in Ash's possession a while later. Well, one thing is clear is that Ash didn't go get it himself. In the series, he stated a few times that he hadn't been back to the cabin since he left, and I hardly doubt that he just so happened to be in a similar wooded area near a similar cabin, but it's pretty evident that someone found the book there. Whoever that might have been found it there, perhaps someone that headed out there in the aftermath of the remake, like police or firemen, or even just one of the other locals like we saw in the film's intro. They probably took possession of the book and took it with them, but the Necronomicon being the Necronomicon and fate being fate, it managed to find its way to Ash, possibly at the beckoning of the book itself, and whoever found it was just made to get it to him, and Ash being Ash, took it home for safekeeping. And by safekeeping, I apparently mean just kind of having in a trunk and pulling out to read from while drunk and trying to impress a girl. Question number 13.
What is canon and what isn't?
With a series like The Evil Dead, what does canon really mean anyway? Rights issues caused them to reshoot things and alter events like the intro in Part 2, which ignores Scotty, Shelley, and Ash's own sister Cheryl. Army of Darkness kinda does this again, recasting Linda and sort of ignoring certain aspects of the second film, like not even showing Annie, hinting that it also retcons the events. But then the TV show throws things into disarray, sort of pulling in elements of all of the movies. But what actually counts? Well, if you chop off the prologues to the movies, it actually does tell a pretty linear storyline. If you take the first movie as a whole, as something that occurs, and then take the second film and chop off the beginning, it fits together as one thing. Simply start Part 2 where the unseen force throws Ash through the woods, and it continues the story fine. Then stop Part 2 as Ash is flying through the portal, and start Army of Darkness after its own recap, and you have one continual storyline that doesn't really contradict itself. The show basically confirms that all three happen as Ash discusses Cheryl and the others being there, which eliminates the prologue bits of 2 and 3 that delete them. For a while, it appears as if the show ignores AOD until later on, in which Ash talks about going back in time before, so even though it's not heavily referenced, it actually is confirmed to have happened. And then, as we've discussed, the 2013 remake is considered to be a part of the actual series by the filmmakers themselves, so it's canon as well. But does that make sense? I mean, all of them have such different feels and formats that they just don't seem like they'd be connected. The first is a straight horror film, the second an over-the-top gore comedy, and the third an action-adventure film. While the remake is more horror-oriented than any of them, and the show is a mixture of everything. So is there any way to account for all of this?
Well, sure. Just make some stuff up.
What if, like the ending of Army of Darkness shows, everything is Ash talking? We see that the whole third movie has been through his filter as he tells the story to a coworker. So it's possible that the first two movies are as well. What if each movie is him telling someone his story, but the way he tells it depends on who he's telling it to? Clearly, his version of Army of Darkness played up his heroism and awesomeness, but since it's to a guy coworker, plays up his manly swagger bits. Maybe he was telling a lady friend of the second movie, playing up his straightforward heroism, casting himself as a more standard superhero. Possibly he's telling the first movie's story to some friends he's trying to freak out, playing up the horror elements instead. Maybe his telling changes with time, or drunkenness, and Ash is clearly not a reliable narrator and probably forgets some details from time to time, which would also kind of cover up all the continuity issues. Now that doesn't really cover the remake because that doesn't seem like a story that he would tell, but maybe that's why the film isn't tinged with the absurdity that the others are. Perhaps all of that was Ash's personal flares added onto the story, so if you strip away his color commentary, you have the more standard horror film that the remake actually was. It should also be noted that going all the way back to 2004, there have been officially licensed comic books, mostly from Dynamite Comics, continuing the tales of Ash, although there was also a separate run of comics from Space Goat Publishing that was unconnected, called Evil Dead 2, since they had the rights to that film. There was also the Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash comics, which adapted the screenplay to the unfinished film, and tons of crossovers with other companies, including the Marvel Zombies. However, due to the TV series, none of these could be considered canon to the film series, though, as the events of that show would contradict anything that happened in those series. So they're their own things. And of course, there's also video games and also a stage musical that are also, of course, not considered canon and each exist in their own universe.
So there you have it. 13 answers to questions from 40 years of The Evil Dead. I feel good that we answered those. I could just go home now.